Blog Talk Radio.
This is BR on the World, our international affairs news program from the people that bring you Bostonred on the 26th of November 2013. Let's start off here out of the Vatican. We have some interesting information here. It's called an apostolic exaltation evangelis gaudium of the Holy Father Francis to the bishop, the clergy, the lay faithful on the proclamation of the gospel in today's world. And I'll just briefly hit the index here. That's literally what it's called here. A joy ever new, a joy which is shared, the delightful and comforting joy of evangelizing. There's one chapter, the new evangelization of the transmission of the faith. In chapter 1, the church which goes forth, taking the first step, being involved and supportive, bearing fruit and rejoicing. Now, I'm not an ecclesiastical scholar, so you'll have to interpret this, but nonetheless, the pastoral activity and conversion, the heart of the gospel, the mission embedded within the human limits, a mother with an open heart. And he goes on to say some challenges of today's world. No to an economy of exclusion. No to the new idiom of money. No to the financial systems which rule rather than serve. Of money. Nonetheless, cultural challenges to inculturating the faith, challenges from the urban cultures, temptations faced by pastoral workers, yes to the challenge of missionary spirit, no to selfishness and spiritual sloth, no to sterile permissiveness, yes to new relationships brought by Christ, no to spiritual wellness, no to warning among ourselves and other ecclesiastical challenges. The entire people of God proclaim the Gospels, a people for everyone, a people for many faces. We all missionary disciples. The evangelizing power of popular pity. Anyway, let's move on here. Just a little bit from what he has to say here, and then we'll do a general summary. The joy of the gospel fills the hearts and lives of all those who encounter Jesus, and those who accept his offer of salvation are set free from sin, sorrow, and inner emptiness, loneliness. Okay, that's how he starts this off. And let's see, we get down here. Evangelization takes place in the obedience to the missionary mandate of Jesus, and go forth and make disciples of all nations. And we'll skip on down here. This is a fairly long deal here. No to the new idolatry of money. One cause of the situation is found in a relationship with money, since we commonly accept its dominion over ourselves and our societies. The current financial crisis can make us overlook the fact that it originated in a profound human crisis, denial of primacy of the human person. We have created new idols and the worship of ancient golden calves. Okay. No to inequality, which spews violence. Today, in many places, we have a call for greater security, but until exclusion and inequality in society between people is reversed, it's impossible to eliminate violence. He's correct about that. The poor and the poorer people are accustomed of violence, yet without equal opportunity, different forms of aggression and conflict will find a fertile terrain for growth and evidently exploited. When a society, whether local, national, or global, is willing to leave a part of itself on the fringe, No political program or resources spent on law enforcement or surveillance, I guess that's directed at the NSA, can indefinitely guarantee tranquility. This is not the case simply because inequality provokes a violent reaction for those excluded from the system, but because socioeconomic system is unjust at its roots. Just as goodness tends to spread the toleration of evil, which is injustice, and tends to expand its bountiful influence and quality to undermine any political and social system, no matter how solid it may appear. That's definitely directed at North America. In every action has its consequences, and evil embodied in the structure of a society has consistent potential for disintegration and death. It is evil crystallization in unjust social structures, which cannot be a basis for hope for a better future. Optimism, or lack thereof. We are far from the so-called end of history, since the conditions of sustainable and peaceful development have not yet been adequately articulated and realized. Now, this is a very important sentence that he puts in here. We hear many of the evangelical characters over the years talk about the end of the world, and the right wing here still talks about it. And his answer to that is absolutely not. That sustainability and peaceful development can be realized. Today's economic mechanisms promote inordinate consumption, yet it is evident that the unbridled consumerism combined with inequality provides doubly damaging to the social fabric. Inequality evidently engenders a violence which recourse to arms cannot and never be able to resolve. This serves only to offer false hope to those clamoring for higher security, even though nowadays we know that weapons and violence, rather than providing solutions, create new and more serious conflicts. We can look at the Mideast situation to see that. Some simple content themselves with blaming the poor and the poor. We hear that happening in the draconian cuts that are proposed for what's called food security or food stamps within the U.S. He definitely needs to exalt the Catholics within the U.S. Indulging in unwanted generalizations, they claim that the solution is an education that would tranquilize them, making them tame and harmless. All this becomes even more exasperating for the marginalized in the light of widespread and deeply rooted corruption found in many countries, in their governments, businesses, institutions, and whatever the political ideology of the leaders. Let me just go on here. In prevailing culture, priority is given to outward, immediate, visible, quick, in other words, instant gratification, and supercation, and provisional, which is really given away to the appearances. In many countries, globalization has meant hastened deterioration of their own cultural roots and the invasion of ways of thinking and acting proper to other cultures which are economically advanced but ethically debased. The fact has been brought up by the bishops from various continents in different meetings. The African bishops, for example, taking up the Encyclopedia Salutae Reis Socialis, I didn't get that right. My Latin here. Anyway, points out years ago that there had been frequent attempts to make African countries part of a machine, a clog of a gigantic wheel. This is often true also in the field of social communications, which is run by centers mostly in the northern hemisphere. Do not always give due consideration to the priorities and problems of such countries or respect their cultural makeups. By the same token, the bishops of Asia underline the extreme influences being brought to bear on Asian culture. New patterns of behavior are emerging as a result of the overexposure to mass media. There's no doubt about that, because there is money to be made in quote-unquote mass media. As a result, the negative aspects of social media and in the entertainment industry are threatening traditional values, and in particular the sanctity of marriage and stability of the family. Well, the right wing always talks about that here, and we'll have to leave this, but nonetheless, this is the document of the Pope Francis, the Papa. And since March, he's been, as they say, beating a different drum from the more reactionary that was there prior to him. The document suggests major changes are on the way, with Francis noting that the Church, this is from the BBC incidentally, to get over attitudes that say we have always done that this way. And we see a lot of that happening, especially in North America, with the treatment of cases of pedophilia. The churches have covered it up, brushed it away, put priests in different places and not told people about it, and interfering in the criminal justice system. Let me go on here. Excessive centralism, rather than providing helpful, complicate the church's life and their missionary outreach. He also says he does not believe that the papacy should be expected to offer a definitive or complete word on every question. Nonetheless, we'll move on here. U.S. bombers challenge Chinese airspace, a provocative act, no doubt about that. The U.S. has flown 252 bombers over the disputed island in the East China Sea in defiance of Chinese air defense rules, officials said. The Chinese set up its air defense identification zone on Saturday, insisting that aircraft obey its rules or face emergency defensive measures. The Pentagon said the planes had followed normal procedure. The islands known as the Sakhalins in Japan and the Diaoyu in China are a source of rising tension between the two nations. Japan has dismissed the Chinese defense zone as not valid at all, and the two of the biggest airlines announced on Tuesday they would abide by requests from the government in Tokyo and not the impending new rules. Well, this is basically provocative, and we've conducted operations in the area in the Sanakwis Islands. So that's from a U.S. colonel named Steve Warren. We continue to follow our normal procedure. Well, the U.S., which has more than 70,000 troops in Japan and South Korea, has previously said it would not abide by destabilizing Chinese imposed zone. Well, the problem here is what does this mean? That is always a huge problem. Does it mean there could be a war? And of course, war has consequences. And this is being very provocative. What would happen if the Chinese shoot down a B-52 bomber? What would happen if one of those airliners bite the dust, so to speak? There'd be rattling of sabers. But this is just a military situation. What could the U.S. do? Yes, they could start a war with China. But does U.S. have the financial wherewithal to do it? The answer there is no. And also the economic implications. Starting a war with China would destabilize this economy, would destabilize the Chinese economy, but not as badly as the U.S. economy and Japan. And also at the same time, the EU zone would be in the mix. So these people are not really thinking about the consequences of this provocative act. Now the Chinese on the other side, when they issue edicts, they'll be forced to back those edicts up. So we'd expect to see some planes, as they say, go into the seas. There's probably no doubt about that. Passenger airliners, probably not. But a running war of that nature would be a major war. The Chinese have nuclear weapons. The U.S. has nuclear weapons. And Japan, probably. But it doesn't matter that much. A war with China would mean Japan would not be an economic power anymore. It would just disappear off the face of the earth. And then the U.S. would be in a quagmire. So President Obama and his team need to literally get a handle on this, because this within itself is a major, major problem. The Russian Federation has urged the Kiev to delay a EU deal, and that's from the Ukrainian Prime Minister. Kiev last year put on hold the association and free trade arrangement with the EU, prompting Brussels to accuse Moscow of external pressure on Ukraine. The Russian President Vladimir Putin has denied putting any pressure on Kiev, accusing instead the EU of blackmailing Ukraine into signing the agreement. Battlefield arms. Speaking to reporters in Kiev, Zarup acknowledged that Russia had suggested to delaying the signing of the treaty and to conduct negotiations between Kiev, Moscow, and the EU. The Ukrainian president, get out here, Viktor Yushchenko, still will attend this week's EU summit in Latvia to discuss a possible consultation with Brussels and Moscow. It had been originally planned that Ukraine would sign the treaty with the EU on the 28th and 29th, the November summit, but that's not happening here. Ukraine's government said Thursday that it was holding preparation for the signing of a deal with the EU. Protesters are accusing the president of bowing to growing pressures from Premier Putin, who wanted Ukraine to join Moscow's led customs union, the group including Belarus and Kazakhstan. So there are competing groups in this particular area, and these trade agreements have been continual source of problems within many areas, including the U.S. The North American Free Trade Act comes to there, and various other trade deals. Many of those are not egalitarian and hurt the workers within those nations. Now, in Venezuela, opposition leaders tell supporters to vote. The opposition there, Enrique Cortes, has told a crowd of supporters. It's interesting how these things are covered. He attracts 2,000 to 3,000 people, and they speak of it as thousands turned out. Well, it's true in the sense that 2,000 or 3,000 or 2,000 or thousands, but the implication of it is actually there are tens of thousands and not true at all. On Wednesday, the National Assembly gave Nicolas Maduro the new powers to rule by decree as to deal with corruption. The Venezuelan government and people are facing food shortages, no doubt caused by these business interests of essential goods, as well as power cuts and inflation of 54%. Now, the inflation they're going to have to deal with, and cut that down to probably about 20%, I would think. But in that sector of the world, inflation always runs very high. Now, Comandante Maduro has also called upon retailers to slash prices by up to 60% as part of what he calls economic sabotage. And that we see in various manifestations. In the U.S., we have the sabotage of the People's Health Program that's called Obamacare. And the site healthcare.gov, and the monopoly media is increasingly in the U.S. pointing to shortcomings that are honestly not that short in the IT world. So we see that, and now a new dimension is happening as the site itself, those technical problems, as in any operation involving so-called IT information technology, things do get cured. And as things get cured, the insurance monopolies in the U.S. are planning a massive multi-million-dollar ad blitz to sign up people and to make people aware of government subsidies that are available. Some of them will be sent to various state exchanges, they call them, or to the federal exchange, or via the companies themselves. So in other words, it's a new day, sort of interesting situation there on some of the propaganda. Let's quickly go to Africa, and we'll close out as our time goes down here. The Central African Republic is, of course, still in the news. It's into chaos, but this chaos is not the cause of the Central African government. It is the cause of other powers interfering there. In Libya, there have been clashes there. In Benghazi being a very unstable city, that was where the so-called counter-revolutionaries started against the late leader that was killed, Colonel Gaddafi, Dr. Gaddafi, in 2011. But it's still going on. It's still very unstable. So the army is basically urging residents to stay in their houses. At the same time, there's a massive strike in the oil fields of Libya by oil field workers wanting a more just compensation. So all these things are still going on. Nothing has changed. The so-called Libyan revolution, or whatever they wanted to call it, has not paid off. It was nothing more than a publicity stunt, quite literally. And one other little note here, I just noticed as I was moving through here on the BBC, the Microsoft has banned swear words on Xbox One. Good luck. Now we'll go to Al Jazeera and wrap this up. They lead with the torturing of Abu Bassa and the art of deception. That's at Abu Ghraib. We'll get into this one a little later. We already covered Pope Francis. And they also have a story here about a consolidation of funeral companies, of all things. This is Al Jazeera. The Afghanistan accord for U.S. troops to leave has fallen apart. The President Hamid Karzai has laid out some rules. They got the so-called tribal elders to go along. The U.S. did, but no doubt they were bought off. So that whole thing is literally in flux. We'll say just a brief word here and move on in a hurry here. From the Guantanamo story, this is name here, Abedin Mohammed Hassan Abu Zabavit. Anyway, I'm butchering his last name. Had endured days of beating, humiliation, and being tied up in stressed positions. His Pakistani intelligence interrogators were not giving up on him. Of course, they were working with the CIA. And they have a picture here of handcuffs. One officer repeatedly struck Abu Ziyada. Nonetheless, to force him to confess to all types of acts. So some of the things that were going on there, and he even gave them, my teacher is Mamu El Milaji. He answered, and confident the interrogators would not be aware of the name of the Egyptian actor. He literally gave him an Egyptian actor, and the fools didn't know what was going on. So that's one story of what was going on with this so-called enhance or brutal torture, that these people confess to anything. That was some of the stuff Pope Francis was talking about, so we have started to tie this up, and we will tie this up. But nonetheless, those were some of the stories, literally from China and the provocative acts there. Pope Francis moving ahead with what, for his particular sect, religious unity, whatever you want to call it, would be progress from the old fascist Pope. We'll see how far he gets along with what he is doing. There, he's trying to have some type of influence on world events. So we'll stay tuned on that particular one. There's another one going on here in the U.S. Supreme Court to weigh religious rights of corporations. This is over contraceptions. They're still messing around with that in the U.S. In other words, the trivial issues. And we'll take one little quick look at Reuters before we get out of here. Their headline here is hardline. This is in Iran. Hold fire on nuclear deal for now. Well, they are, as they say, looking. And Reuters also talks about the defying of the Chinese airspace in those islands, the Sakhalin Islands. That is an ongoing thing. You can sort of see that this media is in to that kind of activity, very provoking. It ties into what Francis said in his religious world of how things are going and the consequences of things. He didn't talk about the unintended consequences. He talked about actual consequences. And this particular episode with the B-52 bombers could end up as with Syria, a war. And then what do you do about it? The U.S. has planes, yes, they have a military. But what about the cost to it? And what about any possible devastation that could happen as a result of it? The Chinese could just simply say, well, we hold a lot of your bonds, dollars, etc. We're going to sell these off. We won't have to drop any bombs on you. Your economy will, as they say, go down the proverbial sink. And this is something they have to think about. This one-dimensional planning is just not working out for them. Nonetheless, this is Bostonred for BR on the World, our international program on the 26th of November, 2013, and it will air sometime today or early in the morning. Good day.